All right. So I hope you can see the screen.
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure. I cannot see anyone. I mean, I can see the people who are there uh, in the panel, right? So is this also showing up in one of the conference rooms, or is it purely online?
I believe this is in a conference room as well. And it sounds like the audio is fine right there in the conference room. So
Yes, we can hear you and see you loud and clear.
Okay, great. Okay, great. So I think, well, then we can get started. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is, my experiences with um, as a part of the delivery teams for large projects, and across the board, there are certain things which need to be addressed, which are pretty difficult to address, um, and this is my experiences of an approach we took to identify security and compliance to the project teams. So let me switch to the next slide. So broadly, what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about the project manager, the PM, and his restricted view of the world in a typical situation, in a typical offshored long distance project being executed from an offshore location, and how that leads to certain blind spots. And that's why I'm calling him the blinkered PM, the person with the blinkers. He can't look to the sides. And then what that really means to the company, to the service provider, and how that creates a risk in the project delivery, and the approach we took to identify that risk, to quantify the risk, and then address that proactively. Okay. So so basically what we'll talk about is the blinkered PM and his restricted viewpoint, what that means in the background, and how we created a risk assessment to identify these issues and surface them at the earliest point, and basically what benefits were accrued to the projects and to the company as a whole. Okay, so I will jump right into this. So here's our blinkered project manager. He's forced to look in one direction, and typically this is what he's looking at. He's looking at the time, cost, scope triangle and saying, I need to make sure that my project delivers to the best possible. And then in addition to that, also looking at it from a more of a governance perspective, where are we in terms of the scope which has to be delivered? Can we are we able to catch up if we are delayed? And if not, um, what do we need to do to get back on track, right? Just excuse me for a minute. So effectively, what we are expecting from our project managers is a very straight focus on the project deliverables, and not enough focus on the peripheral things. I mean, the things which are equally important, but not typically in the scope of the project manager. And when we talk about that, right, it starts from something as simple as the non functional requirements, right, NFRs. So are you sure of what you need to do from the performance perspective? Is it in scope? Should it be in scope? And on the other side, right, it's all about the security. So um, focus of this assessment and the focus of this whole exercise was on the security aspects and on the compliance aspects. So typically, if you look at it, the project manager will not be aware of security. So typically the message we hear is, yeah, security will be taken care of by the customer at some point in time, but it's not in our scope, right? And that is probably was okay in the past, but with the changing risk landscape, it's no longer acceptable, because unless you are able to handle security issues right from the get-go, you will never be in a situation where you are able to catch up and and fix them, right? So it's not enough to look at security from a outside in perspective and say, okay, I've got the perimeter, I've handled it, no more security aspects to be looked at. So I can also not look at it in terms of the deployment environment also, because that itself is becoming a very complex situation, right? So where in the earlier eras, we used to have people sitting in front of a computer. So you would have your users, your user base would be employees of the company, and they would be sitting in front of the computers, and they would be working right there, right? There's nothing else involved. Now you have people who have apps. I mean, we all have apps on our phones, and we all have, we are all mobile. We are always walking from place to place. We are moving from place to place. We are basically switching networks. We are switching, security protocols. We are switching, uh, even from like moving from one cell to the next, right? So that means that um, you have to be more fundamental in terms of the security building in the application. So that is one aspect of it, right? So the risk landscape, the security risk landscape itself is changing. And as you can see, right, when you talk about data privacy, data protection, there are new regulations which are coming up very often, right? So every country in the world is coming up with its own variation of, fundamentally GDPR, or the data protection, regulations, with different focus areas. So some people say, okay, don't use my data at all. Allow me the ability to get my data removed from your system. Some of them are saying, don't do without my compliance, without my consent. Do not use it for functions which I have not approved of. So all of those regulations ultimately have an impact on how the application is designed. And if that is not known to the people on the ground who are working on the project, who are actually writing the code, who are developing and testing the application while it's being developed, then there is no way you are able to actually get that implemented in real time. So you are always going to be, uh, trying to, put a band-aid on, right? So the two visuals basically are showing that uh, while the project manager might be involved in the beginning, where he's told what the scope of the application is, what the scope of the work is, the negotiations which happen when the proposal is being signed um, is completely opaque to the PM and to the PM's team, right? So they don't know what's happening. So it happens, in a rarefied atmosphere somewhere. Somebody approves, somebody agrees, and the risk is actually unknown. It's not quantified. The impact at that point in time is not really known, because how do you judge, right, whether this is going to happen or not happen, and what the downstream impact, what the downstream implications might be, and what could trigger a security incident, or trigger the risk to be instantiated, is also not really well understood. So what actually comes up is a very detailed statement of work, which is written in legalese. Read column clause A in parallel with clause B, and when they're read together, they mean something else. So you get a document which lays out the functional requirements, which lays out your non-functional requirements, and also has security and data privacy, etc. Expectations, right? And that's the first time that the project manager actually sees this and gets to know that, oh, not only do I have to write the code to address the functional requirements, there's a lot more to it besides, right? And that's where the whole situation gets to a point where you are basically setting yourself up for a failure, maybe not from the functional perspective, but from all the other aspects, right? So what does that mean, right? So this, the experience of setting up the risk assessment was basically trying to make something which would make sense to the project manager and the project team, which would not require a lot of um, new learning for them, which would focus on the aspects which were in their control. So what is it that the project manager and the project team, architect, and the delivery teams can do, can address as part of the project delivery, but also to make them aware of what is the linkage from the work that they would do to the open and unaddressed application, security and data privacy, etc., and compliance requirements, right? So what we looked at was to create an assessment which um, um, was lightweight by design. It was easy for the project manager to understand and adopt. Would not take a lot of time, but would be comprehensive enough to actually give a good risk landscape for the project, right? And in this paper, we'll go through these different aspects of the assessment. So the first one, if you talk about it, the option: do you build something? Do you buy something? And we looked at a couple of areas in terms of couple of options of how to go about it, right? The first thing that obviously came to the fore was, why don't you do something which is similar to an audit, right? So you already have the ISMS audit happening, ISO 27001. You already have your data privacy audit, 27701. Plus you have multiple different aspects, right? ISO 9000, etc. And typically the problem there is that uh, a lot of the things which are asked and a lot of the questions or the lot of the assessments which the project manager is expected to address are things which are not in his area of knowledge and things which are not in his control, right? So um, it's difficult for the project manager or the person who's designated from the project to answer that. And that means that a lot of the questions do not get answered, do not get addressed, and the risks inherent are not actually surfaced because of that reason. So one thing we looked at was, the the other aspect that we looked at, or the other option we looked at, was the maturity models. Typically, CMMI, that kind of thing. So the idea is that how well are you prepared? How well or how capable is your project to be able to deliver to certain, um, you know, standard approaches, or are you able to identify and fix different aspects on a continuous basis, right? So are you able to consistently um, deliver different quality and different means of process, right? So process related, right? So that was another thing that we looked at, and we came to the conclusion that it makes sense to create your own assessment from scratch, right? So um, So one more thing there is that if you look at an audit, right, it is inherently a outside in kind of a thing. So it looks at what you have achieved, right, what the project team has achieved, what they've managed to deliver, and then assesses them on how well it was delivered, right? It's not something that gives you a direction on what to do, right? It's not something where there is a prescriptive approach saying that, okay, if you have this risk, this is how you address it, right? So those were some of the things that we looked at, in our assessment, development, and design. And finally, we decided to create our own thing. And effectively, this was something which kind of had been building, which I had been kind of building in my head, from different companies where I'd been working in the past, saying that, okay, there is at least a certain amount of knowledge that the PM needs to have. And there is a certain understanding that the PM has, but is not able to actually identify whether this is the right approach that he's taking, or what is the actual risk involved in trying to um, you know address this issue, or what is the significance of this area that he feels is not correct. But it's he knows from experience that there's something wrong, but he doesn't know what exactly is wrong, and he doesn't know how to address it, right? So we made sure that whatever was captured, whatever was addressed, was something which is in his control, and something that he can actually address during the course of the project to improve the risk, so to reduce the risk and track the progress towards the minimal residual risk that's possible, right? The second thing, of course, was to make sure that it was sticky. So, it's one thing to push the teams to adopt a new process or a new assessment, but it's a different thing where you have to keep on doing that, every quarter, every year. So we wanted something that the project managers would say, yeah, okay, that's fine, I can do this, right? I don't need somebody to push me. I can do this. I understand what it's for. I understand how it's helping me, and then move forward with that. So that stickiness and the understandability is something that we wanted to make sure gets addressed. We wanted a lightweight design. We wanted something that could be quickly rolled out and quickly implemented without too much of development on our side. So the assessment itself should not be something which requires additional development and takes a long time to create it. So that's why we came up with a really lightweight, simplistic kind of an approach, but it addressed the requirements of the company, and I think addresses the requirements of similar Indian service companies which have geographically distributed teams, which have some people who are connected to the corporate networks, some people who are disconnected from the corporate networks, but still all developing and working on projects, and all having the inherent security aspect being required to be addressed, right? The other thing we also did was we made sure that we had capacity to actually um, you know uh, deploy this whole process, right? So make sure that we have people who can guide the project teams and cover all projects which are getting created within that within the quarter, within the month, and quick yes no, give a rating and be done with that, and quickly make sure that you have adequate people to address all the projects that get started in a typical month, right? And then we put in place the governance processes, of course, to make sure that we are um, leveraging anything new which comes up, leveraging new approaches or new ways of working, and incorporate that into our model. So the graphic basically shows, what kind of a spider chart that we created for this assessment, showing the initial starting point and then showing the final stage. So basically brings out the residual risk which is remaining in the project, and that itself is something that would give you a visual view of what's actually happening and how much further you have to go to get it down to the minimal risk possible, right? So with that, let me move on to the next slides, right? So this is something which I already spoke about. Do we want it to be like an audit? And we said no, because an audit expects the project to have done certain things. We wanted this to be more proactive. We wanted it to be something where we are able to surface the risks right in the beginning of the project and not have to wait till half the project was done. Second thing, of course, like a maturity framework, which is more descriptive rather than actually guiding the project team on what they should be doing right at the time of doing it. So it's always backward looking rather than forward looking, right? So we ended up with a custom built framework from our side, right? Okay, and then like I said, this is sticky because it's effective, it's simple, it's easy to incorporate into the project team's project lifecycle. Clear and prescriptive. We basically did not give any choices and said that, okay, these are the 3-4 things that you have to do in case you find this risk. And simple to administer and comprehensive. Simple to administer, it was ultimately a set of 14 questions against which the team had to assess themselves and give a score. And the assistant, the assessor basically would review and work with them to identify what was correct, what was wrong, what was too light a rating that they were giving themselves or too heavy a rating they were giving to themselves. And then moving forward, we were able to actually track it and close it. And then comprehensive in the sense that looks at different aspects of the project and gives you the different areas in which risk could reside and uh, make sure that you are able to identify all of those, right? So the design, like I said, simple, but meeting the requirements of companies which work in different places, different locations. Some of them with the corporate network, some of them without the corporate network. So basically, we used an Excel spreadsheet which could be emailed to the project teams irrespective of where they were, and based on that, they would be able to fill up and send it back to us, right? And we were able to uh, you know accumulate the data into a database, and you would be able to capture which month it was done, whether it was an initial assessment, whether it was an in progress in flight assessment, whether it was a new contract being signed at that point in time, if anything changes, right, significant changes to the project code or the project scope, right? And if it was a final thing. So before every deliverable, we would do an assessment and make sure that the deliverables were actually getting benefited from this whole assessment approach, right? Um, so very clear introduction and instructions were given so that people could actually fill up the Excel without having to wait for me or my team to guide them, to handhold them. And also, where there was clear guidelines on what values to choose. So we gave a non-linear scale, like a Fibonacci sequence, which allowed us to uh, create or focus on the high risk areas much faster. You the typical values for different ratings were given, and also guidelines on when to choose that particular value. which gave us a quick assessment of, what was the risk landscape for that particular project, right? And then, of course, mapping to the action items. So every aspect, every risk and every rating would give you an action item, and that would actually go into the ticketing system where the project manager would be able to track it, and the quality team and our team would be able to track it to make sure that they were getting addressed and some action was being taken against them. And of course, we also integrated this into our executive dashboards so that it would have the level of visibility required. And the assessments were actually combined. So we would combine them by account, so by customer name, or by line of business, or at an organization level, and you'd get an overall risk landscape for the for that different uh, organization cluster, right? And like I said, basically the results would show up in a spider chart showing where you started from and where you are now, and how much more action you have to do to bring it to the minimum risk level that is possible. Okay. So building capacity, like I said, we made sure that we had enough people to address all the new projects that were starting up. And, we would really look at it in terms of, uh, you know, uh, only for very short duration projects, or, POC kind of things. So it's a proof of concept that's being made, or it's a very small project with very little control from the company side, or it is something which is um, a one shot kind of a thing. Within the quarter, it starts and finishes. Then we would not do an assessment, but otherwise all other projects would get assessed. So building capacity, basically we use the quality team to actually do in the process quality team to do these assessments. And not only did we have to teach them uh, to actually run the assessment, but we also taught them how to understand what the project manager is actually trying to do, right? I mean, typically, while they understand it, but there it's a human nature to not be on the quote unquote wanted list, right? So they don't want to be highlighted as a problem child. The project is something which requires extra attention, or has too much of a risk involved in that. So there is always a tendency to try and downplay the risks. So we made sure that the team was aware of what could happen and would question the values if they felt that it was too low, or if they felt that there was things were being called as not applicable when actually they should be picked up, right? And the whole idea behind making the assessment in a way that it uh, gave you a measure of the residual risk was that once you've hit the minimum in terms of what is expected, from a residual risk perspective, we were uh, kind of de-highlighting those particular projects from the dashboard. So even though your residual risk was high, if we know that there is nothing in your control which you can do to reduce it, right, then we would monitor that high risk, but we would not hold it against the project manager. So if he has done whatever, he or she has done whatever they could do to reduce the risk to the minimum, then that's it. That's good enough, and we don't really need to keep on showing that as a high risk project. So that's what we were actually looking at. And then what is the implication of the residual risk? It's a heightened awareness and heightened understanding of what is going on, and not keeping your not letting your eye off that ball, because you have to make sure that the residual risk does not balloon into something bigger because of lack of attention. So what is the implication of the residual risk? how things could get out of control. Those things were being addressed and being told to the project managers. And of course, technical debt, we hear the term often. Basically, what we're trying to say here is that if you don't address it now, you will have to address it at a later stage, or else you will always be a high risk project, right? And that's something that people tend to uh, understand, but not really fully appreciate that it's not something that you can get rid of or you can overlook, right? It is something, especially if you have a long-term project, or if you have something which runs from year to year and has been no changes in either the scope or the type of work that's being happening. You will always, the technical debt will keep coming up and keep showing up to you as um, a risk which has to be taken care of, right? So that's basically how we got the coverage of all the projects of new project launches. And the governance, like I was saying, we made sure that the project assessments were being done in time. There were initial assessments. So basically what we said was that once a new project code is created, so a project is going to start, that the project is going to start. 20 days after that, we would have the first assessment initial, because in 20 days, basically the project manager and the system architect would be aware of the characteristics of the project, the way it is created, or the different um, you know uh, aspects of the work that is to be done, the scope of the project, and you would be able to answer the questions, right? We'll go into a little more detail about the questions in a bit. Then you had intermediate assessments, so quarterly, to make sure that there's no change in the risk landscape, there's no change in the scope of the project, and if there is, we do an assessment for that. And then the pre-delivery, basically, when the project is about to close, make sure that whatever maximum address of the risks could be done has been done, right? And then, of course, the assessment process itself reviews. So, are we doing it well? Are there any issues that the assessors are facing? Are there any issues that the project teams are bringing to the fore? Is there any uh, fault in the analysis, or is it not giving the kind of results that we expect it to give? So we were continuously doing the reviews of the assessment process itself, right? So um, broadly, we looked at, let me just scoot back one to the design, right? So going into a little more detail about this one. So basically, we looked at different aspects of the project itself. Some of it is basically the scope, in terms of not the volume of requirements, but in terms of how much control you have over the project. So how much of the SDLC are you actually covering, right? Are you in charge of design, development, testing, and deployment? Or are you only looking at one of the phases, right? The problem occurs when you don't have control over the entire life cycle, and you are expected to do something, to improve the parts that you are actually working on. And you are also um, trying to improve the overall software, the overall application, without having the scope of the right from beginning to end, right? And typically you would not be writing a new application. Typically you'd be doing some maintenance to it, you'd be doing incremental work, right? And how do you control what you have in your hand, and how do you make sure that you are applying whatever possible to reduce the risk, because the risk to the company is still there, right? If whatever aspects you worked on fails in production or creates a security issue in production, or is a vulnerability has been introduced, then that is still a risk for the company, even despite the fact that you did not have the control to address it from the root, right? The last person who touched the code is the person who is the first suspect within quotes, right? The other thing, of course, is the our development life cycle basically ideally jumps from environment to environment, right? So you have your not fully structured development environments, which is a little less tight in terms of conforming to requirements or conforming to standards. Then you have your test environments where you try and do less control on the data, and you try and pause the application with whatever possible values you have. Then you have your UAT, where you allow the end user to see the application and say, okay, whether this is meeting requirements or not meeting requirements, is fit for use or not. And then finally you have production. So production, of course, being the gold standard. If you have control over the upstream environments, right? If you have control over the upstream, the development, QA, UAT, etc., then you have a better chance, or you have more scope to actually take corrective action on the risks that are identified, right? So the idea was that we will so we ask questions about what's the scope of the work, what is the scope of the environmental control that you have. Okay, I have 10 minutes. That's good. That's basically should go off nothing. We also looked at what kind of technology is being used, whether you're up to you're working with new tech or you're working with old established technologies, right? We also looked at the demographics of the project. So what is the nature of the beast as far as the project is concerned? So that covered things like, is data privacy an expectation? Are you in a regulated business? Are you like for instance, healthcare or financial services, right? Where there's a lot of regulation, there's a lot of um, control, the oversight from regulatory bodies, and there is industry bodies also, which define what you can and cannot do, or what you must and must not do, right? So those things are there, and those add a risk which may or may not be in your control, but is something which you need to be aware of, right? And you need to be able to identify any option or any opportunity to use those use our assessment and take corrective action, right? In addition to that, we also had contractual risks, right? So like we said in the beginning, once the scope of the project is identified and in the estimation, etc., happens, after that the negotiations are opaque to the project manager, right? So um, during that negotiation process, has anything been committed which creates a risk for you, right? So these three broad aspects, which is your technical, your demographic, and your contractual, these were used to make sure that you're addressing all possible aspects of the project, and identifying the risks in all those areas, right? So that was one part of it. And like I said, for each of these 14 factors, we actually created a scale, a non-linear scale, which would focus attention of the project manager and the upstream, the business line manager, etc., onto those areas which were higher risk, right? Um, and I mean, the rest of it is, of course, the same. I mean, basically made it into an Excel base so that it could be sent to people who are sitting on customer websites, or sorry, not customer location, and are not able to connect to the corporate uh, network, right? And effectively, whatever data they fill in, whatever values they fill in, gets accumulated into a database for analytics and reporting, and gets fed back to the project manager saying that, okay, this is the progress you made in the past quarter, and this is how much is still pending to be done. Okay. So what was the end result of all of this, right? What is it that the project manager got, and what is it that the company actually achieved with that, right? So one, of course, is that the project manager is no longer focused only on his three: cost, quality, and scope and time, but is looking at things more from a risk perspective. So risk management, like you say, I mean, as we've heard, or as we are hearing now, is the best or the most practical approach, right? There are certain things uh, which need to be looked at in terms of what can happen, what cannot happen, and nothing is cast in stone that things will happen, right? Nothing is guaranteed. Everything is a risk. Things could not happen. As long as you're able to identify from a risk perspective and understand that it's not a 1-0 kind of a game, but there is always going to be something where you can uh, raise a risk, and you can get some controlling or countervailing controls to be put in place, right? Either financial or uh, you know technical. Then that means that your options from a project management perspective always get bigger, right? They're much wider. So the person becomes so my project manager becomes future ready. He's thinking risk, he's thinking cybersecurity, he's thinking compliance. He knows that it's not just the functional requirements. It's a lot more than that. And being able to look at the entire situation from a risk perspective allows you to take decisions faster and do the comparison between risk and reward, and move forward in a better way, right? So benefits to the company, basically, you move from not knowing what the risks are to more of a portfolio risk management approach. So you can look at all the projects in your company. You can look at BU wise, you can look at account wise, you can look at project manager wise, right? Or how well is this project manager adopting these approaches, right? And we are also looking at residual risk management. Basically, the newer versions of the ISO standards also look at residual risk, how much is remaining, because uh, it's no longer looked at as a zero one game. It's not a binary kind of an option. It's something where you can have some risk, and as long as you're able to address it and mitigate it and take care of it, you should be fine, right? And in certain cases can also be turned into a competitive advantage. So the company can you know uh, uh, showcase the fact that they understand risk and look at it from a risk reward perspective, specifically from the from the aspect of cybersecurity and compliance, right? So this picture, of course, shows the project manager climbing the staircase, the steps, based on different ideas. And the other one, of course, is an interesting one. It purports to show um, the sunrise and sunset at the same time over the North Pole. So I found this picture pretty interesting. So I'm sharing that with you. And that's it from my side. Thank you for your listening, for patience listening to me. And like I said, this is based on my experiences, and it's something which we put together and implemented um, in a rough and ready way to start with, but made sure that the critical integration points were in place, made sure that it is something which is addressing the requirements of the project manager and is intelligible to that project manager, and actually helps him to reduce the risk in a quantifiable way and visually, available to him to make sure that he's on track. Over to you, Sam.